So the first evening service of the month we dedicate to Scripture, study Scripture, learning about Scripture. And I don't usually record those. Hi there, by the way. But this is a little bit different. Part of why I don't usually record them is I think it's probably not very interesting to sit at home and watch me read for 15 minutes or whatever. That seems really boring. But also because I don't want to get accused of imposing on anybody's trademark, on anything. But tonight's a little unusual. I want to explain a few things before I get to the scripture part, so there'll be a little more talking and before we get to the reading, and then also the reading I'm going to do. I'm going to use 4 different translators to sort of give you some different voices. One of which is public domain, so I'm not so worried about the trademark thing. So I was toying with recording anyway, and then a couple of the regulars said they couldn't be here. So, oh yeah, definitely. So we want to record. If you remember, I've been going back and forth between Mahayana scriptures and the older scriptures in the Pali Canon. So, and this is a kind of a Pali Canon night. So, I've been doing that for a while, and I realized if some folks might not really be familiar with what that is, and it might be helpful to give a little kind of explanatory thing as a preface before we get to that. So what we're talking about is what a more formal name for it is what's called the Tipitaka. That's the Pali name, Tripitaka in Sanskrit, but it's written in Pali, so it makes sense to use the Pali name. So Tipitaka. Tipitaka means ti or tri, 3, right? 3. Pitaka is a basket. So it's the 3 baskets, right? And it's called that because when it was first written down, it was written on banana leaf pages that were then stored in baskets. So there were 3 sets of them, so it's called the 3 baskets. And it's also sometimes called the Pali scriptures or the Pali canon, because canon not in the sense of the big gun, but in the sense of like the biblical canon, a list of texts that are seen as authoritative, right? They're kind of accepted by the tradition. And it's called the Pali canon or Pali scriptures because after a couple of hundred years of oral transmission, when it was first written down, as best we can tell, it was written in a language called Pali. And Pali is still the language that's used. It's sort of the the religious tradition language of the southern Asian countries. It's kind of what ties together Sri Lanka and Thailand and Cambodia and those kinds of countries, is that all the scriptures are in Pali. They use different scripts to write them down, but they're all in Pali. Now, just to give you some sense of the bulk of what we're talking about, the total length of the Tipitaka is about 11 times longer than the Christian Bible. So it's an enormous amount of texts. So in modern times, the Theravada tradition that's in the southern Asian countries like Thailand and Sri Lanka and Cambodia and so on sees this as the entirety of the authoritative canon, right? This, as far as they're concerned, these are the texts. Other Buddhist traditions see these texts as part of the canon. They're seen as authoritative, but there's other texts that are also seen as authoritative. Actually, in the East Asian traditions, there's kind of an alternative set of texts that are called the agamas, which are really, really, really similar to what I'm going to be talking about, but they're the Sanskrit equivalent of the Tipitaka. And so the Chinese tradition and the traditions that came from the Chinese tradition use those texts. And mostly they're the same, but there's some subtle little differences. So 3 baskets, so there's 3 parts, right? There's 3 parts to the Pali Canon. There's the Sutta Pitaka, right? Which is the basket of the discourses, the teachings of the Buddha. And then there's the Vinaya Pitaka, which is, lay people don't read that one much because that's mostly the rules for the monastics, right? It contains all the regulations that they have to follow and stories about where all the rules came from and so on. And then the 3rd set is called the Abhidhamma Pitaka. That's the basket of special teachings. Really, it's commentaries, right? It's kind of philosophical and psychological commentaries on the suttas is what's in that one. So obviously the one that we use the most and the one that I've been reading stuff from is the Sutta Pitaka. So let me talk a little bit about how that's set up, because again, for somebody who's familiar with like the Christian scriptures in the Bible, that there's a lot of historical stuff and there's a lot of what narrative, right? Historical narrative, the kind of storytelling. And that's how things are arranged, kind of historical order roughly. And that's not how the Sutta Pitaka is at all. It's chopped into collections called Nikayas, and every Nikaya has kind of a different way that it's organized. And I've got the full collection of, well, not quite the full collection, almost full collection of them over there on the second shelf in the bookcase, the great big huge fat books from Wisdom Press. So let me just briefly explain kind of how these are organized. So the Digha Nikaya is the collection of long discourses, because the scriptures that are in that book are long. There's only 34 texts, and it's a really long book. So they go on for pages and pages and pages. So the thing that one has in common is it's just the length. The first section of them, there's 3 parts in it, and the first section has a lot of stories that are about morality, right? So there's a lot of useful stuff in that. The Majjhima Nikaya is the collection of middle-length discourses, so they're not quite so long. There's 152 texts in that book, so they're kind of a few pages long each. Teachings of the Buddha, teaching of the chief disciples of the Buddha. The Samyutta Nikaya is a collection of grouped discourses, and it's called that because it's thematically arranged. There's collections of really short texts, because there's almost 3,000 texts in that book, so they're just like really, really short. Some of them aren't even a page. And they're in themes by the content, and they're organized thematically. The Anguttara Nikaya is the collection of what's called factored discourses. There's several thousand there, different editions and different translations organized. Some books have just a little more than 2,000. Some books actually count up to like 9,000 almost texts, just how they divide things up. But they're all grouped by lists. Buddhists love lists. So they're arranged by, there's the book of ones and the book of twos and the book of threes and the book of fours, and like everything in the book of fours is about things that there are 4 of, or things where the teaching is focused on. There's the first point and the second point and the third point and the fourth point. So that's kind of an interesting way to organize them. And then the last one, what I'm actually going to read from tonight is from the last text, collection, what's called the Khuddaka Nikaya, is the collection of little texts or lesser texts, which is a little bit different because there's, depending on the country that you go to, there's anywhere from 15 to 18 different volumes. And they've never really been compiled in one kind of thing you could hold in your hand, like the other Nikayas I was talking about a minute ago, in part because there's some of those texts have never been translated into English. We still don't have an English version of them. And it would be really big and fat if you did try to sort of put it all, you couldn't put it all in one book, for sure. Now that last bit, the Khuddaka Nikaya, again, minor text, lesser text, that makes it sound like it's trivial, not very important, but actually some of the most beloved and read texts in that tradition are from that collection. So for example, there's the Sutta Dhammapada. I actually do have a copy of the Sutta Dhammapada up there. It's another big thick book. Just to illustrate, the Metta Sutta, the loving kindness sutra that we read in the full moon ceremony, comes from there. There's the Therigatha and Therigatha. Those are collections of poems written by early monks and early nuns that are just short, little, very pithy, sharp poems. And then something else that's a beloved collection that's part of that is the Jataka tales. Those are stories about the earlier lives of the Buddha, the prior lives of the Buddha, his previous births. And then also in that collection is the Dhammapada. So that's what I'm going to read from here in just a minute. So Dhammapada, the path of Dhamma. Pada literally means foot, but foot implies step, and step implies a path. So Dhammapada, the path of the Dhamma. The closest thing to what's contained in the Dhammapada in the Christian tradition, if you're familiar with it, a lot of people aren't because it's not actually in the Bible, there's this alternative gospel called the Gospel of Thomas. And it's basically just a collection of sayings. It's just sort of one saying and after another, quotes, attributed to Jesus. And that's kind of what the Dhammapada is. There's no structure, there's no narrative. It's just a collection of sayings that are organized in chapters by theme, what the sayings are about. There's 423 verses. They're organized into 26 different sections based on theme. The first translation of it, and actually the last piece I'm going to read, is from the original English translation of it. Max Muller, the pretty famous religious historian, back in 1870, published the first English translation of it. Which weirdly enough was not based on the original source, but based on an earlier Latin translation of it, which is just weird. And since then, there have been it's probably pushing 100 different translations of this text now, and you can buy, I think half of them are on Amazon right now if you go look. So just to give you a sense of why this is important, Jack Kornfield, who's a pretty well-known insight meditation teacher, he wrote the preface for this version, which was translated by Gil Fronsdal. So in the preface of this one, Jack Kornfield wrote, "These verses of the Dhammapada sum up in the simplest language the core teachings of the Buddha. Memorized and chanted by devoted followers for thousands of years, these words remind all who hear them the universal truths expounded by the Buddha. The Dhammapada's elegant verses, many spoken by the Buddha over long years of his teaching, were assembled by his senior monks and nuns to express his essential wisdom." So to a lot of people, the Dhammapada is kind of the core bit, right? This is kind of the if you know what the Dhammapada says, you kind of know probably the most essential and important things in Buddhism. So what I've done is I went through and I've pulled out 4 pieces that I think will be useful to familiarize you with the text. And and each of them is from a different I'm going to use a different translation for each one of them. So this first piece, which is I want to read the beginning, right? The beginning of it is really pithy. So I'm going to read some sections from the first chapter. This was translated by Juan Mascaro. So let me read a little bit from his version. "What we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind. If a man speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows him as the wheel of the cart follows the beast that draws the cart. What we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind. If a man speaks or acts with a pure mind, joy follows him as his own shadow. He insulted me, he hurt me, he defeated me, he robbed me. Those who think such thoughts will not be free from hate. He insulted me, he hurt me, he defeated me, he robbed me. Those who think not such thoughts will be free from hate. For hate is not conquered by hate, hate is conquered by love. This is an eternal law. Many do not know that we are here in this world to live in harmony. Those who know this do not fight against each other. He who lives only for pleasures and whose soul is not in harmony, who considers not the food he eats, is idle and has not the power of virtue. Such a man is moved by Mara, is moved by selfish temptations, even as a weak tree is shaken by the wind. But he who lives not for pleasures and whose soul is in self-harmony, who eats or fasts with moderation and has faith and the power of virtue, this man is not moved by temptation, as a great rock is not shaken by the wind. Even as rain breaks through an ill-thatched house, passions will break through an ill-guarded mind. But even as rain breaks not through a well-thatched house, passions break not through a well-guarded mind. He suffers in this world and he suffers in the next world. The man who does evil suffers in both worlds. He suffers and mourns when he sees the wrong he has done. He is happy in this world and he is happy in the next world. The man who does good is happy in both worlds. He is glad, he feels great gladness when he sees the good he has done. He sorrows in this world and he sorrows in the next world. The man who does evil sorrows in both worlds. I have done evil, he thus laments, and more he laments on the path of sorrow. He rejoices in this world, and he rejoices in the next world. The man who does good rejoices in both worlds. I have done good, thus he rejoices, and more he rejoices on the path of joy. If a man speaks many holy words, but he speaks and does not, this thoughtless man cannot enjoy the life of holiness. He is like a cowherd who counts the cows of his master. Whereas if a man speaks but a few holy words, and yet he lives the life of those words, free from passion and hate and illusion, with right vision and a mind free, craving for nothing but now and hereafter, both now and hereafter, the life of this man is a life of holiness. So you can see that first chapter is, different authors call it different things, but it's pairs of kind of opposite expressions that give a contrast. Chapter 11 is on aging. And so I'm going to read it from a translation. I don't have this one in the book. I have this one electronically. Acharya Buddharakkhita, who is a lay Buddhist teacher. This is from his translation. When this world is ever ablaze, why this laughter? Why this jubilation? Shrouded in darkness, will you not see the light? Behold this body, a painted image, a mass of heaped up sores, infirm, full of hankering, of which nothing is lasting or stable. Fully worn out is this body, a nest of disease and fragile. This foul mass breaks up, for death is the end of life. These dove-colored bones are like gourds that lie scattered about in autumn. Having seen them, how can one seek delight? This city, the body, is built of bones, plastered with flesh and blood. Within are decay and death, pride and jealousy. Even gorgeous royal chariots wear out, and indeed this body too wears out. But the Dhamma of the good does not age, thus the good make it known to the good. The man of little learning grows old like a bull. He grows only in bulk, but his wisdom does not grow. Through many a birth in samsara have I wandered in vain, seeking the builder of this house of life. Repeated birth is indeed suffering. O house builder, you are seen. You will not build this house again, for your rafters are broken and your ridgepole shattered. My mind has reached the unconditioned. I have attained the destruction of craving. Those who in youth have not led the holy life, or have failed to acquire wealth, languish like old cranes in the pond without fish. Those who in youth have not led the holy life, or have failed to acquire wealth, lie sighing over the past like worn-out arrows shot from a bow. Chapter 18. Chapter 18 is, I've decided to use this piece because for those folks who are working on the precepts, this is about corruption, and so this is very relevant to the idea of the precepts. So this is from the Gil Fronsdal translation. As rust corrupts the very iron that formed it, so transgressions lead their doers to states of woe. Oral teachings become corrupted when not recited. Homes are corrupted by inactivity. Sloth corrupts physical beauty. Negligence corrupts a guardian. Bad conduct is corruption in a person. Stinginess, corruption in a giver. Evil traits corrupt people in both this world and the next. More corrupt than these is ignorance, the greatest corruption. Having abandoned this corruption, monks remain corruption-free. Easy is life for someone without conscience, bold as a crow, obtrusive, deceitful, reckless, and corrupt. Difficult is life for someone with conscience, always searching for what's pure, discerning, sincere, cautious in clean living. One digs up one's own root here in this very world if one kills, lies, steals, goes to another's spouse, or gives oneself up to drink and intoxicants. Good person, know this. Evil traits are reckless. Don't let greed and wrongdoing oppress you with long-term suffering. And then the last piece I want to read, this is from chapter 23. And this may sound a little bit archaic because this is actually from that original 1870 Max Muller translation, but I thought this was a good thing to end with. This mind of mine went formerly wandering about as it liked, as it listed, as it pleased. But I shall now hold it in thoroughly, as the rider who holds the hook holds in the furious elephant. You'll notice there's a lot of elephant mentions in this chapter. Be not thoughtless, watch your thoughts. Draw yourself out of evil way, like an elephant sunk in mud. If a man finds a prudent companion who walks with him, is wise, and lives soberly, he may walk with him, overcoming all dangers, happy but considerate. If a man finds no prudent companion who walks with him, is wise, and lives soberly, let him walk alone, like a king who has left the conquered country behind, like an elephant in the forest. It is better to live alone. There is no companionship with a fool. Let a man walk alone. Let him commit no sin, with few wishes, like an elephant in the forest. If an occasion arises, friends are pleasant. Enjoyment is pleasant, whatever be the cause. A good work is pleasant in the hour of death. The giving up of all grief is pleasant. Pleasant in the world is the state of a mother, pleasant the state of a father, pleasant the state of a samana, pleasant the state of a brahmana. Pleasant is virtue lasting to old age. Pleasant is a faith firmly rooted. Pleasant is attainment of intelligence. Pleasant is avoiding of sin. So those are the pieces from the Dhammapada I thought might be useful. It's a much longer text. Up at Muddy Water, Zen Temple in Royal Michigan, which is kind of the mother house for this place. There's a couple of clergy who almost every Dharma talk they give is based on the Dhammapada. Because it's such a universal text. It just provides such an essential basis for living a good and worthy life. If you don't own any other Buddhist scriptural texts, if you have no Buddhist books in your house, this would be the one to get. I mean, I think this is a good kind of basic text to refer to. Maybe it's the only one you need, right? It really could be the only one you need. You could do a lot worse in life than keeping a copy of the Dhammapada on your breakfast table and read a piece every morning, or on your bedstand and read a piece every night, or heck, just get 2 copies and put one in both places and read a little bit in the morning and a little bit at night, and you really couldn't do any worse than that. To kind of start and end your day, with meditating and reading a little bit from the Dhammapada. I don't think you could do better than that. It really is a very basic, provides a very good basic foundation for living a good life, I think.